Hello friends, and welcome back to another React hooks video. In this one, we are going to talk about useReducer hook. So in the previous one, we talked about useState as our first state hook, and this is the second state hook, useReducer. So I will have three examples. One is going to be very simple, second one is going to be working with form, and the third one working with objects. So, and for each of those, I'm going to create a file or a component. I've already created my project using Vite, and I've deleted everything except the app component, and in that I have only one h1. So in the source folder, I'm going to create a file, call it simplex, for example, and of course it's going to be a JSX file. So let's create our function, simple example, and it's going to be a arrow function. So we need to export this one so we can import it in our app. I just want to rename this file too because I used the small s. I need to use the capital S here. All right, so this is going to be our component, and I'm just going to import it in our app. So import simple x or simple example, and I'm just going to add it down here. All right, so back in documentation, we have this syntax that tells us how we can initialize and use the reducer hook. So I'm just going to copy this one and paste it here as a comment so we can see the boilerplate, and I'm going to return a markup here. Of course, let's just have a div in here, and the first thing I want to do, I want to console.log just the hook useReducer, and we need to import it from React and of course invoke it inside this console.log. So just like useState, this gives us an array with two elements. The first one is going to be our state, or the variable that we want to change and we want to work with it in our markup. The second one is going to be the function that allows us to manipulate the state. Now the difference between this one and useState is that with useState we have only our initial state within the parentheses of this hook, and then we were able to manipulate that directly or replace it directly using the set function that we would use. Now with useReducer, we can do the same thing, but all the logic regarding changing our state goes inside this reducer function. Let's create our first reducer hook. Let's say I want to have a name and then a function that would be setName. And now I'm going to use the reducer hook, and this takes three arguments. The last one is optional. The first one is going to be our reducer function, and for now I'm just going to pass an empty anonymous function because I don't want to leave it empty. Our initial values are going to be anything we want to. It could be any data type, and I'm just going to pass a name here. Let's say Mike, and I'm going to leave this initial value. We don't need to use it, it's optional, but I will show you in another example what happens if we do use it. I'm trying to start very simple. All right, so that is our useReducer state, and let's use it in our component. So we just want to grab the name. Of course, we get Mike. Now let's create a button here, and I want to change the name when I click on it. So let's call it change, and on the click event, we want to invoke a function. So with useState, we would do this. We would call the set name and then pass another name. So let's see if this works. I'm just going to pass something else and refresh the page and click on this change button. We get an undefined state now. So we have lost our state. That's because this function is in charge of replacing it, and we are passing an empty function. We are not doing anything in this function. The reducer function takes two parameters. One is our state, in this case is the name, and the other one is the action we want to perform. And I'm going to accept those parameters, so state and action. And I understand writing this in line is not a good practice. Again, I'm trying to keep things very simple, and then we will extract this outside. All I want to do now, I'm just going to return the state, see what we get. We want to see what does this reducer function do. Let's give it a refresh, and I'm just going to click change again. So we get the same thing, but we are not losing our state anymore because we are returning it. So this state is our current state. So the reducer function takes our current state, and then the action is going to be whatever action we want to perform. In this case, we want to pass the string John to the action. So if I, instead of state, just return action and get rid of state, right? And give it a refresh, click change, we get John, but we lost our current state. That means we replaced it and we didn't return it, so that means we lost it. However, if I actually return a state plus action, this would work because I know both of them are a string, and give it a refresh and click change, we get Mike as our current state as we specified here, and then John as the value we passed into the reducer function. So think of this set name as a collection of functions. And that's what reducer does. The reducer function holds all the logic for our state management inside itself. So let's have another example, but move this reducer outside and refactor our code. So I'm going to create a function, call it name reducer. So you can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to call it name reducer. And again, we are going to take the state, which is our current state, and the action we want to perform. Now, usually we would check for the action in this function. We want to say if the action type is change, we want to perform some action. Now, the action parameter can be any type of data we want. We could say if the action type is 1, we could call it whatever if the action name is 1. This is just to check that we are performing in a specific action, and by convention we have a type property and then we give it a descriptive name of what sort of action we are performing. So I want to say if the action type is change, and then return a new string John, otherwise just return the state as it is. Remember, this is our current state. This is the action we want to perform. Down here, I'm going to get rid of this inline function and pass that name reducer as our reducer function. All right, so when we click on this set name, we are passing the string John. This is not going to work. So let's give it a refresh and click on this button. We are not doing anything and we are not calling this function because now this set name is a collection or is an object, and we need to pass an object and specify the type of action we want to perform. So we said type is going to be change. So we just want to pass that one here and say the action we want to perform is change. So let's save, give it a refresh and click on this one. Now we get John. So if I change this to anything that is not specified up here, let's say some nonsense, and click on this button, nothing's going to change because we are returning the state. If I comment this out, so there is no else block, and click on this one, we lose our state because we are not performing anything again. So that's the simplest example of the useReducer hook. Now, all of this code can be just written in one line. So I'm gonna delete everything. And since we are using arrow function, we don't need the return keyword because we have only one statement. So we want to say if the return type is change, then return John. Otherwise, just return the state. So this is our reducer, just one line of code. And if I change this to the correct type and click on the change, we get John. All right, so this is our simple example. Let's jump to the form example and see how we can use the useReducer on forms. So I'm going to create another file in our source folder, and I'm going to call it form example or ex, and it's going to be JSX. So again, we're just going to say const form example, and of course we need to export that one. So let's go back to our app and import our form example, and I'm going to comment this out. So we will see a clean screen. There we go. And let's use the form now. All right, so I'm going to close the simple one. All of this code will be available on a GitHub repo. So first, let's return some markup here. So we will have just a simple form, and we don't need the action, of course, and we just need an input field that is going to be a name. So we're going to accept a name from the user, and then another input field of type number. So I want to accept the age of the user, and let's give it a min of 0 and max, let's say 60 or 90, and give it a placeholder of age. And that's what we see. Let's have a button too that says add or submit. All right, so we don't have any logic at the moment. We just have a simple form. So normally we'd use a state. We would create our state up here one by one and then add the value and unchange events to our inputs. We can do the same thing with useReducer. So I'm going to call this form data, and the function is going to be form set form data. And of course, we're going to use the reducer hook, and this is going to take a reducer again. I'm just going to call it form reducer, and for the initial state, I'm going to pass an object that is going to have a name with an empty string and the age again with an empty string. So this is our initial state. Remember, back in our simple example, we just had a string. Now we have an object, and like I said, we can pass anything. And in the next example, we will see how we can use this initializer. So by the way, I'm going to copy this one and add it here. So we see the boilerplate. All right, so let's attach these form data properties to our inputs. So for the name, we can set the value to form data dot name, and we're going to do the same thing for the age. All right, so I saved the document, and that's why we have an error, because we haven't defined the form reducer. So let's define our form reducer function, and it's going to take the state again and the action. Now, right now, the state is this one. So what action we want to perform here? We want to set the form. So let's have another if statement here and check that if the action type is set, then we want to do something. So for now, let's return an object that would contain the state and the action. All right, so we still have this warning because we are not providing any unchanged event for these input fields. So let's provide the unchanged event for the name input, and we need to accept the event, then use the set form data. Now again, with use state, we would just pass the target value and we would be able to use it in our application. But for this one, we need to pass an object. Just like what we did in the simple example, we are passing an object and specifying the type. This time we need to actually pass something. So let's say type is going to be set, and this time I want to pass the value of this input field, and I want to call it title, where the value of this one is going to be target, so event target value. Right, so let me reformat the code so we see better, so I can explain what's going on here. Right, so in this input field, which is our title text field, we are setting the value to this form data name, that is our state, and at the moment it's empty. But when we type inside this input field, we are saying that we want to set that title, that name, sorry, this should be name. We want to set that name to whatever the user types in here. And we are going to use our reducer function, and it checks for the type if that is set is going to perform that. Now at the moment, I'm just returning this action and state, and what I want to do, just console.log form data. All right, so let's give it a refresh and type inside this input field to see what happens. All right, so we have our action that has a name property and it is set to whatever we typed in here, and of course we have the type, so that is coming from here. We also have our state, and you can see inside the state we have another action and another state, and inside that state we have another action and another state. That's because this is being called every time we typed, and we typed 3 characters, that means 3 times. So at first it was empty, then it was a, then it was as, and then ASD up here. So that's because we said when we typed in here, we want to call this function and check for the reducer type and then return the state and the action. So but we do know, so if we ignore the first ones, we know that our action has a name property with the value that the user is typing inside of that. Now let's do the same thing for the age down here. All right, so we just want to change this name to age. All right, and right above the form, I'm going to create an h1 and just output form data.name and another h1 that says form data.age. Now we want to type in here and get the name above these fields. It's not going to work though, because we are returning them as objects and we cannot output objects in React. So we can spread these state and action and then get the values out. So the state is going to be name and age, and the action for this one is going to be name, for this one is going to be age. We are using the spread operator because we just want that value. We don't want the type, for example. We just want the name and the age. So if I type in here now, it's working, and if I add some numbers, you can see it's being updated on the fly. So we know it's working, and we are getting the data out of the input fields, and it's in our state just by this simple statement right here. And again, because we have only one statement, this could go in one line. So I'm going to cut everything out here and say if the action type is set, then return an object that is going to be spreading the state as well as the action. All right. Otherwise, we are just going to return the state as it is. All right. So this should be triple equal sign. Sorry about that. And I think we're good. So let's give it a refresh, start typing. Yeah, still works the same way. So this is our reducer. This is our state, and we just have a console.log. But now we want to actually do something when we submit the form. So I'm going to create a function here, call it handle form submit, and we are going to accept the event because we need to prevent the default. So in React, we need to manually do that ourselves. So when we submit the form, I want to call the set form data again because I want to add something to it. And again, use the object, much like what we did here. We want to say if the type is set, then create a new property for us. And I'm going to call it output and set it to a template string. So I want to grab the form data name and say is form data age. So we want to say, for example, Mike is 32 years old. And we can do this because this form data is our state. And as we type inside these input fields, our state is being updated. So now let's attach this handle form submit to our form. I'm going to get rid of one of these h1s. I need the other one. And on the form, I'm going to attach the unsubmit event and just called that handle form submit. Now, instead of outputting the name, I'm going to output this output. So now it's not going to output it on the screen for us as we type. It's going to show it when we click on the button. So let's say John, and the age is 32, and submit. John is 32 years old. All right, so that is how we can use useReducer with forms. Now, this is of course preference, but in my opinion, it is still better to use the useState hook for forms, but I just wanted to show you how it works. Now, let's have our last example, which is going to be working with objects. So I'm going to create another file here and call it object example.jsx. So inside the file, I'm going to create object example and set it to an arrow function, and of course make sure we are exporting it. All right, so back in our app, I'm going to close the form. Back in the app, I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to copy paste this one and change it to object example, and down here I'm just going to output it so we have it on the screen. All right, again, I'm going to grab one of these comments and paste it here as a reference. So let's return some markup here, and I'm just going to say object. There we go, it's on the screen. So in this example, we will have something much more closer to a real world example, and we want to, for example, have data coming in from an API and then output it on the screen and then perform some actions using the reducer function. So the first step is to create our state. Let's call it posts, and the function is going to be, of course, set posts, and we are going to call the useReducer, and again, it's being imported automatically for me, and I want to call this reducer function posts reducer. And for the initial arguments, I'm going to pass null. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the initializer or the init function, and I'm going to call it init posts. Let's go back to the documentation for a moment. And if we go scroll down here, we have the optional init. Now the initializer function returns the initial state, and if it is not specified, then the initial state is set to initial arguments, which is this one, and that's what we've been using. But now I'm going to pass the initial posts. That means it's going to override this null. So let's make comments as we go along. Initial posts, and it's going to be a function. We called it init posts, and it's going to return an array of objects. Now imagine this is actually getting filled or getting populated using an API call, and usually we would have arrays of objects. So I want to have posts objects, and these objects would have an ID, a title, let's call this one post1, and then a likes count, which is going to be 0 by default. So again, imagine this is an array of a lot of objects that are coming from an API, and we are initializing our reducer using this function. So let me console.log posts. We need to define our reducer too. So if we don't, it's going to give us an error. So posts reducer, and we called it posts reducer. For now, we're going to leave it empty. We just want to see our posts, our initial state. If I save this one, we get an array of one object. That's what we have. And that is because we are specifying this one. If I delete it for a moment and refresh the page, we get null, of course. But there is a bit of a difference between these initial arguments and the init function. If we go back to the documentation and down here on the avoiding recreating the initial state, we have two examples that says passing the initializer function and then passing the initial state directly. So the initializer function does not run when the component re-renders. In this example, when you type in the input field, this is not going to re-render. But if we use the initial state directly, that is going to re-render the whole initial state. And we're not going to see it, but this code is less efficient. So if you are grabbing the data from an API, make sure you initialize it using the function and not pass it as the initial argument. All right, so that's one note about the third optional argument, initializer. Let's get back on the track. So we know we have our post here, and the first thing I want to do, I just want to output it on the screen. So we will have a posts array, and I want to check if posts length is greater than 0. That means we have some data in it. We are going to use the logical operator and say posts dot map. So we're going to map over it, and for each post we are going to render a markup. So I will have a div, and the key for that one is going to be post ID, and then inside that div we will have maybe an h2 or h3 for post title, and then two buttons. So one button to delete a post and the other one to like a post. For the like, we will have the number right next to it. So posts dot likes. I'm sorry, this should be post. So post.likes. I called it p here, and I've been using this word p. So this should be p. I'm sorry. I'm sure you saw it. Okay. So this is our markup. And of course, we are getting post1 because we have one object in our array. So let's write our reducer. And so far, we've seen our reducer function using only one condition or one type. Now, usually that's not the case. We use the reducer hook because we have a lot of actions to perform. So let's accept a state and action just like what we did before. Now, by convention, we would use a switch statement, and the key is going to be action type. So we want to check the type in these cases and then perform some action. So the first action is going to be add. So we want to add a post to our list, and we want to return a new object, right? So we want to set the ID to something, let's say 2, and we want to set the title to post 2. This is just hard coding it, but we will refactor this one. And the likes is going to be 0. We don't need the break statement because we are returning something. And by default, in this switch statement, if none of the cases matched, we are going to just return the state as it is, which means just one post. Now let's have a button somewhere here, right above the posts. I'm just going to say button add, and when I click on it, I'm simply going to call the setPosts function and pass the type as add. That's what we called it up here. And let's make sure that we use an anonymous function because we don't want to invoke it right away. And save it, refresh. Now, if I click on this add, you can see our post is gone, and we are actually getting the new object, which is just one object, and we get nothing on the screen because there is no array anymore. This condition evaluates to false, therefore none of this is happening. So we are replacing our state. So keep in mind, a state in React is read only. So every time you are mutating your state, we are actually returning a new state, and we cannot just add to it. So we need to return a new array in which we have our state and then add one to it. And we are using the spread operator before the state. That means we want whatever is within this array. So if we had 2 or 10 or hundreds of objects, this would be all of them plus whatever we pass here. All right, so let's give it a save this time. We have our initial state and press add, we get post 2, of course. Now, this is hard-coded. Let's say we want to grab the title from the user, and the ID is going to be auto-generated. For the ID, we can have just a variable outside of our function and set it to 2. And I'm starting at 2 because this one is 1. And instead of hard-coding number 2, I'm going to use that next ID and add 1 to it. So every time we click on this one, this is going to be 2, 3, 4, and so on. The likes is going to be 0 by default, but the title I want to grab from the user. So I can say action.title. So remember, this action is an object. And like what we did in the form, we created our own properties inside our action. We can do the same thing. And we want to say that we expect a title property on the action. So this is our action right here. And we have a type property. That's good. Now we need a title property. Let's say post 2. And I'm going to add number 2 like that. So let's say post 2. Now let's save it and refresh. Press add. Of course, we get post 2. So whatever we pass down here and press add is going to be our new post. All right, so we know this is working, and we can actually have an input field later on to grab the post title from the user. For now, I'm going to focus on delete and like. So we already have one case in which we are returning a new state with our new post. Let's say we want to delete one. So I want to have another case. This is going to be delete. And all we need to do in here, return a new array. So we don't need to actually spread it out, or we don't need to accept anything. We just want to return a new array. And we can do that by grabbing the state as it is, which is an array, and filter it. So we know that JavaScript filter function returns an array based on a condition. So we want to loop over every post. I'm calling it P. And I want to say if the post ID is not the same as action ID, so we will accept an ID, then return the state. So this would return every post that is not the same ID as the action ID. And the action ID is coming from this button where the user clicks on it. So let's attach an unclick event to the delete button. And we can do this in line, or we can type it up there. So I'm going to create a function up there. I'm going to call it handle delete. I'm going to add a comment here and just call it reducer hook. And down here, I'm going to say handle delete. All right. So for our handle delete, we are going to create a function handle delete, and we need an ID because we said the action is going to provide the ID for us. We will call the set post. We want to set the type to delete because that's the action we want to perform, and the ID is going to be ID. So we don't need to say ID colon ID because they have the same name. We can just pass ID as it is. Now down here on the click event, we need to pass the ID and we need the post ID. So again, this is P, I'm sorry, and we need to make sure this is inside an anonymous function. All right, so let's save this one, refresh. I'm going to add post. So post 2 and then post 2, post 2. So we have 4 posts, even though they have the same title, but you can see the IDs are different, 1, 3, 5, 7. And you notice the ID is being incremented 2 times, and I'll explain why in a second. So let's delete this one, post 2, with the ID of 3. So let's do this and expand this one. You can see that's gone. So we have 157. Let's just have a quick detour about this IDs being incremented 2 times or even getting logs 2 times. That's because of this component in our main JSX. The React strict mode component is supposed to help developers to find bugs and errors, and it renders or triggers certain functions and certain state hooks twice. So keep that in mind. This is happening because of this. So if we delete this one, let's delete it just for the time being and refresh and add a couple of posts and expand this one, you can see it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can still delete. So everything works the same way, but because of that component, certain things trigger twice. So, and you can read all about it in the documentation. All right, so we are able to delete the post. Let's apply the like functionality. So we want to say we have another case. It's going to be like, and this is a bit tricky. We want to return an array with the state filtered. So we know that the filter function returns an array, and this is going to be an array of objects like this. Let's say state first. I'm just going to apply the filter first, a state filter, and we want to check for every post and see if the post ID is the same as action ID. This time we want to like it, right? So we need the same ID. Now, if this is true, I'm going to pass ternary operator and say if this is true, set the post likes equal to post likes plus 1. So add 1 to it. But if it is not true, just return that post. So this would go through the array and checks the ID, and it says, okay, ID of 1 is the same as action ID, so I'm going to increment the like. But if it was not match, if this was false, it is just going to return that post without incrementing the like, so as it is. Now this is going to give us an array. So again, we don't want an array inside of array. So we want to spread this out and we should be good to go. So let's give it a save and reformat the code so it looks nicer. And on the like button, we want to perform another onClick event. So I'm going to copy this one and paste it down here. Instead of handle delete, I want to say handle like, and it's still going to take the ID. So up here, we have handle delete. Just going to copy it. Just down here, I want to make handle like. So the action, the type of action we want to perform is like, and we are still expecting the ID, and the logic is up here. All right, so let's give it a refresh and like this one, 2, 4, 6. Again, this is happening because of our component, and I am just going to cut this out. So the like is being incremented, and we can add posts, and we can like them, we can delete them, and so on. Now, for the last part, let's have an input field up here to add the title for our forms. Right above the button that says add, I'm going to have an input field, and I'm not going to use a state or useReducer because what I want actually, it's just one input field, and I want to grab the value when I click on this button. So because the button is not part of the input, we need to have a reference for this one. And there is another hook in React for that, which is a very simple one. It's useRef, and that is short for reference. So I'm going to create a variable here, call it title, and set it to useRef. Now we need to import it from React, and we need to initialize it just like that. So now this title is our reference, and we can use it on this input field and set ref. It's going to be title. Now I will have a video about ref. It's going to be a short video because it's very simple, but we're going to use it for this purpose because it makes things a lot easier. Now instead of passing the function like this down here, I'm going to create another function up there. So let's say right above the handle delete, I want to add a post. So const handle add, it's going to be a function. It's not going to accept anything, but it's going to do this. So I'm going to cut this and add it here. And we don't need to use an anonymous function because we are not expecting any arguments. So we want to call the handle add. Now, before I actually do this, I'm just going to console.log the title. In fact, I'm going to change this to title ref because we already have a title and I don't want to have the same name. So we know we are talking about the title ref. So in all of these occurrences, I'm just going to change this ref to title ref and console.log title ref, which is up here using the useRef hook. This is where we are, and I have a typo I can see in my handle add. So let's just make sure we spell that correctly and add it down here. All right, let's see what we get when we click on this button. And what does this title ref do? So refresh, add, we get an object with the property current, and that is telling us what is the current element that we are referencing. So if we grab the current and refresh, press add, and we get the input field. Now, of course, if we chain value to that current, because input fields have the value property, right? And type something in here and press add, we get that value. We need to use this value inside our setPost function. So I'm just going to cut this, and instead of hard coding title, I'm going to pass that one. So we are performing an add action, and we just need the title because up here we said the ID is going to be incremented automatically. The title is going to come from the action, which is down here, and the likes is going to be 0 by default. So let's give it a save. Let's refresh. Let's add post 2, and we get post 2. Let's add post 3. Let's add post 5, and so on. And we can like each of these or delete them, and everything works the way we want to. And that's basically how you would use a reducer in a real world example, because you would have a lot of functions, a lot of logic that you want to separate them from the components. Now, normally this reducer is inside its own file. So if we were to create a file here, call it postsreducer.js. So it's just going to be logic. We don't have any markup, so we just use JavaScript. And we can cut this whole thing out and paste it here and then export it just like that. Now we have a problem with this ID. Now we could either accept it as a parameter or just add it here. So I'm just going to add it up here just for simplicity, and save this one, go back to the object and get rid of this next ID and import the post reducer from that file. So let's save, refresh, and add something here, and you can see it's working the same way. So the logic now it's outside of our component, and that's the point. So anyway, that's it, guys. This is the useReducer hook, and it's a bit more complicated than useState, of course. So I hope this video has been helpful and you enjoyed it. I want to thank you all for your likes, shares, views, support, and everything, and I'll catch you at the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.